Egyptian drums echoed in the night. Hebrew slaves groaned under. The weight of their burdens, the foreman's whip came down mercilessly. But in the midst of oppression, a child floated on the Nile River, unaware. This child's destiny will be to become his liberator. The town is a story of slavery and redemption by a God who challenged the empire of a man called to lead his people from a nation formed in the desert, and a promise that would transcend generations that the Egyptian gods could not keep. The sea can stop it, but the army cannot stop it. Overcome it, because when God decides to deliver his people, nothing can stop him. Stop is not the people of God. Slave, how a slave defies a pharaoh when a sea opens in. Two, as a nation has walked 40 years in the desert and survived. This is not just an old story, but a warning. Message and revelation for all. Time, let my people go. Years passed and the Israelites thrived in Egypt, which had been a place of refuge. In the time of Joseph, son of Jacob, also known as Israel, has become a prison of oppression. A new Pharaoh has emerged, who did not know Joseph, who looked at the Jews with fear, and he said there were so many of them, they were so strong, if war broke out, they could join in our enemies and escape from our hands. So Egypt made a decision to make Israel a slave. Son of Jacob, the children of Abraham, the people of the promise, are now prisoners of Egypt. But the more they were oppressed, the more they grew stronger, and the fear of Pharaoh increased. If they continue to multiply, we will not be able to control them. Finish them off. Then a new decree was issued, a decree that was filled. The horror of every Jewish home, every Jewish male born, will be thrown into the Nile. And only the girls will survive, but in mourning and pain in a humble tribal home. Levi was born a child destined for change. The story that was later named Moses, I couldn't let them kill him.
Permitir que lo maten. Debo esconderlo, aunque me cueste la vida.
For 3 months, his mother hid the child. Every cry, every noise was a danger of death. But that day came, that he can't hide it. So he made a decision, prepared a basket, covered it with tar, and placed it. With a whisper asking mother, "What will you do, my dear daughter? I will put your life in your hands." God, protect us. There's nothing more I can do. That's all I can do. I have a basket floating on the Nile among the reeds. Crocodiles in the same waters where other Jewish children died, but this child was not affected by death because God had a purpose for him. And the Pharaoh's daughter went down to the river and saw the basket floating in the middle of the river. The reed, when the girl opened it, the child cried, and his heart was moved. This was a child.
Pero lo criaré como mío.
To let the free child Israel be raised in the Egyptian palace and received a royal education. He was educated as a prince, but at heart he was not Egyptian, he was a Jew. And one day he would discover it in the most painful way that Moses grew up in the home of Pharaoh, lived among gold and greatness, and was educated in science. The Egyptians learned the art of war, but although the body was dressed as a Prince, his soul belongs to another, fate has called him, and the day of his awakening comes most painfully. Moses decided to visit his people. The Jews walked between. The Jewish slaves had calloused hands and their faces were covered with sweat and tears. And then an Egyptian foreman saw him brutally beaten. A Hebrew slave again and again, without mercy. Moses felt the anger burning inside. I approached him. There was no one else. There were witnesses. The foreman continued to beat him repeatedly, and then I took action. Moses raised his hand and the Egyptian fell down dead in a short time. The Hebrew slave ran away in silence, but Moses knew what Moses had done. Knowing that his life would change forever, he covered the corpse with sand and he fled. But the next day, when Moses tried to calm the fighting between the two, one of the Hebrews looked at him with contempt and said, "Who made you judge? You think you can kill me like you killed that guy?" Fear gripped us. Moses, the news spread, and when it reached Pharaoh's ears, ordered Moses killed, fled the palace where he grew up, fled from the people he was supposed to liberate, fled aimlessly until he reached the land of Midian. Change in Midian. Moses finds refuge. The years pass. He marries Jethro's daughter Zipporah, a priest of that land, and for 40 years he became a shepherd. Egypt's life was left behind. The mission of youth was lost in the desert sands. But God did not forget Moses, because one day in the mountain of God, the fire called him. One day, like any other person, guided sheep on the mountainside. Job, when I saw her, a bush was burning, but it was not consumed. Moses came, and suddenly the fire said, "Moses, here I am. Don't come near. Take your shoes off your feet, because where you are is holy land." Moses knelt down and covered his face, for he understood who spoke to him, saying, "I am the God of your father, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob." Moses trembled, but God did not. "I have finished speaking. I have seen the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry, and I have come down to rescue them and bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey. For that reason I send to Pharaoh, you will take out to my people Egypt." Moses looked up at the burning fire. The voice continued, echoing in his mind, but in his heart fear paralyzed him. "Who am I, O Lord, that I should come before Pharaoh? Who am I that I should be brought forth? I will be with you, O Israel, and this will be the sign that I have brought you out of Egypt. You will serve on this mountain, but if they ask what your name is, what will I answer them? I am who I am. Therefore you shall say to the children of Israel, I am who sent me. I am who I am. Therefore you shall say to the children of Israel, I am who sent me." He was a man without power or army. Now he had a mission. It was not possible, but he also had the promise that God would go with him in Egypt. Shall know the power of the God of Israel. Moses came down from Mount Orab. The fire still burns in his mind. The echo of the divine voice still resonates in his heart. But the mission God gave him seemed impossible. He was just a shepherd. Most powerful king on earth. Sir, I am not a man of words, never. I clumsy of mouth and tongue, who created the human mouth for. He speaks to the mute, he sees the blind, but I am not God. Go, and I will be with you and teach you what you must say. Lord, send another. Silence fell on the mountain, but God's voice remained unchanged. Aaron, your brother, will speak for you. Take this silence in your hands, because to him you will perform miracles, so that Moses will leave the desert and return to Egypt. He fled as a fugitive. Now he returns as a messenger of God with Aaron appeared before the elders of Israel and told them everything God had told him. He said that the elders believed, bowed, and worshiped because they knew that God does not forget them. Moses and Aaron entered Pharaoh's palace. The king's eyes lit up with pride. The pillars of his throne were made of gold and ivory. Egypt was the most powerful empire on earth. The two men were nothing before him, but Moses raised his staff and spoke to the Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may serve in the wilderness. Serving in the desert, the hall was silent, and then Pharaoh laughed. Who is the Lord?
That I must obey his voice, I do not know your God nor spare. The Pharaoh of Israel looked at his stewards to see if they had time to talk. Freedom is because they don't work hard enough. From today, we will not give them any more straw to work. Bricks that they collect themselves but continue to produce those bricks in quantity. And if they do not do it, let them be punished, and thus the burden of Israel becomes heavier. The Jewish administrators were beaten. The people became desperate and began to complain against Moses. You promised us freedom and now we suffer. Worse yet, Lord, why did you allow this when I told Pharaoh, his wickedness has increased? And you still have not freed your people. God said, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh with a strong hand. I will force him to let my people go. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will stretch out my hand and bring them out of Egypt. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. He gave Moses signs and wonders, and then Moses returned to Pharaoh's palace. And miracles. Then Moses returned to Pharaoh's palace, but this time he did not come alone. He came with the power of the God of Israel, Moses and Aaron. They stood before Pharaoh. Aaron said loudly, "The God has spared my people." Pharaoh folded his arms impatiently, and Moses ordered him, Aaron, to throw his staff on the ground. And it became Pharaoh's advisors were terrified of the snake, but Pharaoh remained undeterred. Pharaoh looked at his magicians and sorcerers. It was all their God could do. The Egyptian magicians also threw down their sticks. And they became, but Aaron's serpent devoured the other priests. The Egyptians trembled, but Pharaoh was hard-hearted. This is just a cheap answer. My answer remains the same. I will not let go of Israel. And so the judgment of God fell upon Egypt, and no human power could stop him. Egypt challenges God. Pharaoh stubbornly refuses to listen, refuses to bow. But now the Lord will speak with judgment, not with words, which by the sign that Egypt will never forget the first disaster. Moses and Aaron standing on the banks of the Nile. Life the pride of Egypt, but now it will be its destruction, Moses exclaimed. Thus says the Lord, let my people go, or the waters of the Nile will turn into blood. Aaron raised his staff and struck the water. And the river turned red. Dead fish floated. The stench spread everywhere. The Egyptians tried to get water from all over the land, but every spring, every well, every stream of water turned to blood. This does not impress me at all, my mages. They could have done the same, and Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused to let the Israelites go. The second disaster. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand and I will bring frogs all over the earth. Aaron raised his staff, and rivers from ponds rise, frogs and swarms of bees fly all over the palace, fly into houses, jump on beds. They put food in. All of Egypt became a chaotic swamp. Pharaoh said, pray to your God to take away the frogs, and I will let them go. Your people Moses prayed, and the frogs died. The stench of death filled Egypt. But when Pharaoh saw that the plague was over, he hardened his heart and would not let her go to Israel. Third calamity then. The Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your rod and the dust will become gnats." Aaron struck the earth with silence, and dust rose like a black cloud then. Billions of lice have been destroyed, covering the earth, people and animals writhing in discomfort. Egyptian priests tried to replicate the plague but failed. Then an Egyptian magician said with fear, "This is not a trick." This was the finger of God, but Pharaoh did not listen, and Egypt paid the price. Wednesday disaster then. To a black cloud, a deafening buzz of black flies filling the air, billions. They enter the eyes and the mouth. The plague has invaded the land. But in Goshen, where the Israelites lived, there was not a single fly. Then Pharaoh desperately told Moses to go worship your God. But inside Egypt, Moses replied, "We should not go to the desert." Pharaoh's answer then went but not far. Moses prayed and the flies disappeared. But Pharaoh changed his mind and became hard-hearted. Once again, the fifth plague by God. He said, "I will bring a plague on the livestock of Egypt, but the livestock of Israel will not be touched." He said, "I will bring a plague on the livestock of Egypt, but the livestock of Israel will not be touched." And the next day the Egyptian cattle died, cows, sheep, horses, but in the land of Goshen no animal died. Pharaoh looked upon the disaster, but he did not let Israel go because his heart was still. The sixth plague has set in. Then Moses and Aaron took the ashes from the furnace and scattered them into the air, and the ashes became a sore. On the Egyptians, a painful gas covered their bodies. The Egyptian magicians could not even stand before Moses. But Pharaoh did not bow down. Seventh disaster. Moses raised his staff and the sky darkened. The wind roared and then hail and fire fell. The mixed storms crushed fields and trees. Men uprooted and kisses dead Egypt never saw anything. Then Pharaoh was afraid and said, "I have sinned against the Lord. Pray for this storm to stop and I will let you go." Moses prayed and the hail stopped. But once again Pharaoh hardened his heart. The sky has darkened due to the pandemic, but not because of the clouds. But using swarms of locusts, the insect armies ate up everything that was left. Egyptians watch in horror as the ground disappears under a blanket. Destruction. Pharaoh despaired, saying, "I have sinned, pray for me and I will let you go." Moses prayed and the wind blew away the locusts, but Pharaoh did not keep his promise. And the ninth disaster happened. Moses stretched out his hand and Egypt was plunged into darkness for 3 days. Total darkness, the sun did not shine, the fire did not burn, but in Goshen the children of Israel lit. Pharaoh with a broken voice said, "Go, but leave the cattle." Moses faced him, "We will not take. Get out of here. If you see me again, you die. So I will not see your face again." The 10th and final disaster. Night comes, death is coming, and all Egypt will cry. Egypt is on its knees. The disasters have destroyed the land, fields are devastated, animals are dead, towns are plunged into darkness of despair. But there is still a final judgment on Egypt's darkest night. The time is coming when God tells Moses that I will bring a final plague on Egypt. And then Pharaoh will let you go at midnight. I will go through the whole land of Egypt. And every firstborn son of Pharaoh's son shall die, even the son of the slave woman. But in Israel I will distinguish first. Passover. God instructed his people that that night would be the first Passover. Moses cried out that each family take a lamb without blemish, we sacrifice it, and with his blood we mark our doors, for judgment is coming. But blood will protect us. The Jews ate hastily with sandals on their feet and staff in hand, ready to leave. Ready for the call of freedom, night falls, and in the darkness the angel of death had come, and it happened at midnight. Egypt woke up with screams. Of horror, the Pharaoh's firstborn son died. The slave's firstborn son died. The firstborn of cattle died. There was no house in Egypt that did not have one. The cry was heard from heaven. The judgment of God had fallen. Pharaoh spoke in a hoarse voice, almost a whisper. Arise, come out from among my people, and go and serve your God as you have done. Say, take your cattle, take everything you have. But come out and bless me after 430 years of Egypt. The children of Israel were freed from the chains of slavery that were broken. For the Lord has heard their cry, and Egypt will never be again. Last night in Egypt there was... When the Israelites came, they were formerly a people of slaves and marched as a free nation. Men, women, children, from youngest to oldest. From the strongest to the weakest, they carried their belongings, livestock, gold and silver that the Egyptians gave them because Egypt wanted them to leave. Egypt wants to forget them. Egypt fears the God of Israel, but still the trial is not over. The verdict has been rendered, but the final battle is yet to come. God delivered them and did not let them go alone that day. A pillar of cloud guided them. The road at night, a pillar of fire lit the path Moses was walking. God's promise awaits them, but the enemy is not done with them yet. What did we do? We let the Jews go. We have to bring them back. Then Pharaoh gathered his army of 600 chariots. Thousands of soldiers were selected, the most fearsome cavalry of Egypt, and with anger. Burning in his heart, he went out to pursue Israel. Israel, parade children laughing. The old people were smiling, but suddenly a scream of horror rang out from the last row standing up. The old people were smiling, but suddenly a scream of horror rang out from the last row standing up. Behind them, the Pharaoh's army seemed to be a mirage of a desert with no escape. Then the Israelites said in despair, Moses, you brought us here to die. There are tombs in Egypt. Fear gripped their hearts. Panic took over their minds. But Moses did not tremble because Moses knew something that they did not know. They knew not to fear, to stand firm, and to see the salvation of the Lord for the Egyptians. That you see today, you will never see them again. God will fight for you, and you be quiet, God said to Moses, lift up your stick, your hand over the sea, and gave the children of Israel to pass through on dry land. Moses. On the right side is a wall of water, on the left side another wall of water. And in the middle of the road to freedom, Israel looks at the miracles with amazement, and one by one, they began to walk. The land was dry, the sea was tamed by the power of God. Children ran, old people moved forward with tearful eyes. The glory of God protected them, but the Egyptians did not follow them and took us back. The Egyptian chariots went into the sea and the wheels began to jam.
The horse stumbled and panic spread among the Egyptian soldiers. They say with horror that God fights for Israel. We did, but it was too late, God told Moses. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea to make the water return. Egyptian, I stretched out my hand to the wind and changed the country. They roared and the sea returned to its place, the mightiest army. The strongest men in the world were swallowed by the sea, the chariots. The horsemen disappeared and were swept away by the waves. What did Pharaoh see? Power was sinking before their eyes, and the people of Israel stood up on the shore. The enemies they feared were just corpses floating on the water. The Israelites looked at God's work, and at that moment they believed and spoke out. I will sing praises to the Lord, for he has made himself great in the seas and on the seas. I will sing praises to the Lord, for he has made himself great in the seas and on the seas. The women danced and the elders wept for joy, because that day the Israelites stopped. Became slaves on the day Egypt was defeated. On that day God honored the nations of Israel who crossed the sea. Egypt was left behind, but freedom was not just freedom from slavery. God did not bring them out of Egypt just to set them free. He brought them out to become his people. But before entering the promised land, they would receive his law, and on Mount Sinai, God would call them to a covenant. 3 eternal months after leaving Egypt, Israel came to the desert. Come to me, Moses, and speak these words to the children of Israel, what you have seen. What have I done to the Egyptians? How can I bear you on eagle's wings if you obey me? And you keep my covenant, you will be my special treasure, a kingdom of priests, a nation. Moses obeyed. I went down and gathered the people. I told them everything God had said. And with one voice they replied, we will do everything that God says. On the 3rd day, Mount Sinai shook and thunder tore across the sky. Lightning flashed, a thick cloud fell on the mountain, and the trumpet sounded in the air. Israel trembled. The old men knelt down. The children hid in their mother's arms. Because the Lord came down in fire, smoke covered the mountain, and the voice of God was heard like thunder, shaking the whole world. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, or you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember, keep the Sabbath day holy, honor your father and mother, and do not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet. Of your neighbor, everyone has heard the voice of God. Their hearts trembled and they were afraid. They turned their backs on the mountain. But then the Israelites were afraid and said to Moses, speak to God and tell us what he says. But God doesn't speak to us directly, or we would die. Fear of God has come to test you so that your fear may be in you. And do not sin. So God gave the law to Israel, a sacred covenant, a covenant that would make them his holy people. But the people's hearts were not yet ready to obey. And while Moses was in the mountains, Israel would collapse in its first great test. Moses climbed the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. But in the village camp, some people have lost faith. The Israelites muttered, Moses is gone. Who will lead us now? Aaron replied, they were unsure. What do you want me to do to make us a god? A god go before us, for we do not know what happened to Moses. Aaron gathered gold of the people and made a golden calf. Is it your God, or Israel, who brought you out of from Egypt? Israel went wild. They danced and celebrated. They bowed down to the calf, but on the mountain God saw everything falling apart. Moses, your people have sinned. They have gone astray. Let me destroy them, and I will make of you a great nation, O Lord, if you destroy them. The nations will say that you brought them out to kill them in the desert. Forgive them. God heard Moses' prayer, but not Israel's sin. Will not be punished. Moses came down the mountain, and what he saw filled his heart. In anger, the people danced around the idol and bowed before the calf. They forgot their God Israel. Perhaps God rescued us from Egypt. Did you not hear his voice on the mountain? Why have you become so corrupt? Moses quickly lifted the tablets of the law and smashed them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. Then take the golden calf, burn it in the fire, and grind it until it is dust, and sprinkle it in water. Make people drink it. Moses said, "Whoever is with God, come to me." The sons of Levi gathered together with Moses, and God's judgment fell on the idolaters that day. 3,000 people died. And the people's hearts were broken. Moses went up the mountain again. And again he prayed for his people, saying, "Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, eyes show me your glory. I will make my kindness pass before you. But you will not be able to see my face, because no man can see me and live." And God renewed his covenant and gave Moses the tablets of his new and glorious law. Down the mountain from that day, Israel is no more only a group of freed slaves, is a holy nation, a people. He had dedicated it to God, but his journey was not over yet. Because before entering the promised land, they had to go through the greatest challenge of their lives. Israel life received the law. They saw Mount Sinai covered in fire. They heard the voice of the living God. But God did not call them just to give them commandments, but he wanted them to live among them. And that is why he commanded to build his dwelling in the land which God had spoken of. With Moses say to the children of Israel, "Make a sanctuary for me among them, and you shall do to me all that is in my sight. The pattern that I will show you is gold, silver, and bronze, fine linen, and purple wood. Acacia and precious stones for my glory will fill this place." Where Moses gathered the people and the children of Israel brought their offerings. The craftsmen were filled with wisdom, the curtains were woven, the ark was set up, the altar was carved, it was consecrated. And when the tabernacle was completed, the Lord came down upon it, and the cloud covered the tabernacle. And the Lord made the sanctuary so strong that even Moses could not enter it by day. Clouds covered the camp, and fire shone among the Israelites at night. And when the cloud lifted, the people knew they had to march. God guided them, God went with them, but even though God was in the midst of his people, the heart of Israel is still rebellious. The real test is about starting the people march from Sinai. The promised land is not far away. But the path to it will be a challenging one, because although God has given Israel from Egypt, Egypt is still in them very soon. Their unbelief will bring judgment upon them as soon as they enter the desert. When some Israelis started complaining, "We have no water," he brought us in. Moses was here to die of thirst. Moses cried out to God, and God made water come out of it, the rock. But then we had no food in Egypt. We had bread and meat, and God sent manna from heaven every morning. Bread covered the ground like dew. Feed them, but people are still not satisfied. They keep complaining. They continue to reveal themselves until the day their unbelief is revealed. Israel is condemned to reach the limit of the promised land, just one step away. We're just one step away from receiving what God had promised them. Moses sent 12 spies to discern the land. The spies traveled around Canaan for 40 days. And when they returned, they brought with them the fruits of the earth, but they also brought with them fear, the first spy. He said with fear that the land was good, but the people living there were giants. Fortified cities with impregnable walls. We will not endure, we will be devoured, a people herd and fear-filled heart. And that night Israel rebelled against God for us to return to Egypt. We will not enter this land. Then Joshua and Caleb said, "Do not be afraid. If God is pleased with us, he will give us. I do not rebel against him in this land, but the people want to stone him. And in that moment, the Lord comes in glory till you will despise. I say, you shall not enter this land, your generation shall perish in the desert. And your children will enter the land, but you will wander in the desert for 40 years. Moses knelt down, the people cried out in despair. But the verdict has been announced, they will never enter the promised land. But the rebellion was not over in the desert. A man called Korah rebelled against Moses, and 250 men challenged him. The leader Korah said arrogantly, Moses, who placed you above us, are all saints. Why do you exalt yourself above the people of God? Moses fell face down on the ground and God spoke to them. Judgment tomorrow, God will show who belongs to him. The next day, Korah and he, the men of God, stood before the tabernacle. The people surrounded them, and Moses. I said, if these men died like any other, then God would not have sent me. But if the earth opens and swallows them up, then you will know that they have brought wrath upon God. And at that moment, the earth opened up to the earth. He cut his followers in half and devoured them. People fled in terror that day. Israel knew that God would not tolerate rebellion for the past 40 years. In all, Israel wandered in the desert. One generation died and another. He grew up under the guidance of God, who sustained him throughout his slavery. In Egypt now, only a memory, the people were at the gates of the promised land. But before crossing the Jordan River, they were not ready. Moses had a final teaching for his people. The people of Israel gathered thousands and thousands of people. They gathered before Moses, their faces expectant, their hearts beating. And then Moses said, listen, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Take these words I send you with all your heart, soul, and strength. Today they will be in your heart. You will teach them to your children. You will talk about them. In your house when you lie down and when you wake up, you will tie them on your hands. They will be like fronts between your eyes. For the Lord is your God, and there is none else besides him. The people listened in silence because Moses not only spoke to them, but also. He warned you when you enter the promised land not to forget God. I have bowed down to the gods of Canaan and have not separated you from the covenant. Because if you forget God, you will be blessed among all nations and live in houses you did not build. I will plant vineyards that you did not plant, and the Lord will fight for you. For he is the God of you, his people. Moses looked at the people, the faces of children, the eyes of the elderly, the hearts of youth, and knew. For God had told him that he would not cross the Jordan River, he would not enter the earth. Go up to Mount Nebo, see the earth from afar, but you will not enter. Moses led Israel for 40 years and witnessed the power of God. Spoke to him directly, but now he must hand over leadership to another God who has chosen a new leader, who will lead the Israelites into battle. That he would conquer the promised land. His name was Joshua. Moses was called Joshua before the people, and that he laid his hands on him and said to him, be strong, be courageous, because you will bring Israel to the promised land that the Lord will go before you. Because you will bring Israel to the promised land that the Lord will go before you. Joshua fainted, bowed his head. Everyone looked on in silence. Israel had a new leader. But Moses had to go up the mountain, never to return. Moses went alone up Mount Nebo. The wind was blowing in. From there he saw the promised land, the Jordan River, and the plains of Jericho, the hills of Canaan. The land that God swore to Abraham. Moses saw it. But he did not pass because his journey was over. Moses took a deep breath. His eyes were lost on the horizon, and then God called him home in the solitude of the mountain above. Moses closed his eyes and stayed therein. On Mount Nebo, Moses died. There was no funeral, no lamentation for God. He buried him in an unnamed valley, and to this day, no one knows where he is. His tomb was Israel mourned Moses for 30 days. They regretted it. But then he took up the sword and looked toward the promised land and God. My servant Moses spoke, but now he is dead. Arise and cross the Jordan. The land that your ancestors promised me, I will now give it to you. Be strong and know that be courageous, because as I was with Moses, I will also be with you. That is how Moses' life ended. He entered the promised land but left an eternal legacy because the law that God gave him still lives. And his name will never be forgotten because he will never live again. Prophet in Israel like Moses, whom God knew face to face. Dear all, if you have made it this far, I want to sincerely thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Throughout the book of Exodus, this project was a challenge that required months of dedicated effort. And the enormous resources we invested in our team to bring this story to life in the most epic and authentic way possible. But every second was worth it. It is a shame because this is not just Moses' story, but the story of the people. God's story of faith, liberation, and redemption continues to speak to us today. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment because the story of Israel does not end here. We continue and will release the next movie very soon. Hello and see you again.